Welcome back to the Journeyman Podcast, everybody. We're back with another deep dive. This is episode 14. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and giving us a like. It really helps us out. Today, we're looking at Neil McCoy Award, specifically his video called So You're Not Going to Believe This One, More Insane Exposures Revealed. Neil is a YouTube commentator who often talks about government waste, fraud, and spending. In this video, he brings up some really interesting, some might say outlandish claims.
Yeah, some of his claims are definitely eye-catching.
For instance, he claims there have been $2.7 trillion in improper payments from Medicare and Medicaid. He even claims some of that money went to people overseas or to people who have, well, passed away.
Wow, 2.7 trillion is a huge number.
It is, and he also talks about the Pentagon spending tons of money on seemingly mundane items. He suggests this could be a cover for, black projects.
The mysterious black project.
Exactly. But then he goes on to talk about millions of dollars spent on things like coordinating Zoom meetings. And he talks about reports which analyze previous reports which were deemed ineffective.
Sounds like a lot of red tape.
Definitely. And he also touches on funding for a rapper in Gaza. This rapper apparently produces anti-Israel content. Then he brings up some concerns raised by European politicians. These politicians are apparently worried about misuse of U.S. aid in Greece and Slovakia. What do you think about all this?
Well, I think it's interesting how Neil seems to tap into this distrust many people have towards government spending. He presents all these examples in rapid succession. It can be pretty overwhelming. And I can see how people might walk away thinking, wow, things are really out of control.
Right.
But I think we need to carefully consider the context of each of his claims. For example, that $2.7 trillion figure for Medicare and Medicaid needs some context.
What do you mean?
Well, that number often comes from government reports that look at a wide range of things. They weren't just looking at fraud, but also payment errors.
Oh, I see. So maybe not intentional wrongdoing, but more like a huge system struggling to keep up.
Exactly. Medicare and Medicaid are massive programs. They process millions of transactions. It's almost inevitable that there will be some errors.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But, the question is, what are they doing to try and minimize those errors?
Right, and Neil actually does mention the government's efforts to cancel some questionable contracts, like that $101 million for DEI training grants.
DEI being diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. He sees it as wasteful, but you could also argue that it's important for creating a more inclusive workforce.
It's definitely a complex issue with arguments on both sides.
For sure. Another thing that really stood out to me was his discussion of the media. He tells this story about an employee at Doge, the cryptocurrency company. Apparently, this employee was fired because a journalist had been looking into his personal beliefs. The reporter in question, Catherine Long, I think, was digging into the employee's online activity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Neil even casts doubt on whether this journalist actually exists. He claims there's very little information about her online.
It's interesting, isn't it? You can really see the distrust some people have of the mainstream media.
Yeah.
I think this distrust is being fueled by several factors, the rise of social media, concerns about bias, and also the sheer amount of information we see every day.
So much information.
It can be pretty overwhelming. So it's understandable that some people might question the motivations of journalists or even their existence.
Yeah. Neil even goes as far as to say that the media is being weaponized. He thinks taxpayer funding is being used to push certain agendas.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and I'm not sure if I agree with him on that.
Well, it's definitely important to be critical of all information sources, including the media, but we also need to understand how journalism works. Real journalists have to follow ethical guidelines. Fact-checking is a core principle. But that being said, bias can exist, and sometimes it's not even intentional. It's always a good idea to consider the source and look for evidence-based reporting.
So it's all about being media literate.
Yeah, being media literate.
Being able to analyze information and understand different perspectives, not just taking everything at face value.
Exactly.
Speaking of not taking things at face value, Neil also talks about the Federal Reserve. He says that, contrary to what many people think, it's not really independent, and that it's subject to congressional oversight, so it can be audited. He points out that Congress created it back in 1913, and he talks about how there have been attempts to audit it. But it seems like there's been a lot of resistance to that.
The Federal Reserve is definitely a source of mystery and misunderstanding. It was designed to be somewhat independent to avoid political interference.
Right, so they can focus on managing the country's money without, political pressure.
Exactly. But, that doesn't mean it should be completely free from oversight.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance.
There needs to be a balance between its independence and transparency.
I see what you mean. So even though Neil's pushing for a full audit, it might not be such a straightforward issue.
There are definitely valid arguments for and against it.
And it's important to keep in mind that Neil comes from a financial background. He's an entrepreneur with a focus on financial matters. So that probably influences how he views the Federal Reserve and government spending.
For sure, our backgrounds and experiences always shape how we see the world. I think his entrepreneurial spirit probably makes him very sensitive to things like government overreach and what he sees as wasteful spending.
Yeah, I could see that. And, he's a skilled communicator. He uses strong language and vivid imagery to get his message across. It's entertaining.
It is entertaining.
But we have to remember that this style can also be quite persuasive.
Absolutely.
It could lead people to accept his interpretations without really questioning them.
He's part of a growing trend of independent commentators online. Many of them have a lot of influence because they're charismatic and know how to connect with their audience.
Like our show, right?
Exactly. It's why it's so important to be media literate. We need to be able to evaluate information from all sources critically.
Whether it's traditional media or independent voices online.
Precisely.
Lots to think about. We'll be right back to continue dissecting Neil's claims and what they might mean. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about Neil's distrust of the media and his concern about the Federal Reserve. But he also brings up some other interesting stuff like U.S. aid.
Oh, yeah. He talks about that quite a bit.
He questions how that aid is being used, especially in places like Greece and Slovakia.
Yeah, he mentions those countries specifically.
He talks about letters from European politicians. They're worried about how these funds are being managed. He even implies that some of this aid could be used for political manipulation.
Like pushing certain agendas?
Yeah, or even favoring specific political parties.
Interesting.
It definitely plays into the skepticism a lot of people have about foreign aid in general.
Yeah, you always hear stories about aid money being misused or ended up in the wrong hands.
Right, and even when it is used for its intended purpose, development and humanitarian efforts, there's always a risk of unintended consequences.
It's complex, and Neil gives this example of FEMA funds being used to put migrants up in luxury hotels.
Oh, wow.
He sees that as a total waste of taxpayer money. He even quotes a Greek politician who's demanding an investigation into how those funds were allocated.
So it ties into the whole immigration debate as well.
Absolutely. It's a hot-button issue for sure.
And Neil definitely doesn't shy away from expressing his opinions on it.
No, he doesn't. He uses some pretty strong language at times.
Which, resonates with a certain part of his audience.
For sure.
And it shows how online commentators can shape public discourse. They tap into these existing anxieties and present what seem like simple solutions to complex problems.
Right.
And it's something listeners really need to be aware of when they're consuming information from different sources.
Yeah, it's all about critical thinking. And speaking of solutions, Neil actually calls for a complete overhaul of the government, like a major downsizing.
Wow.
He points out that there are something like 75,000 federal workers who have accepted offers to resign.
Really?
Yeah, and he talks about Elon Musk's ideas for streamlining government processes, like simplifying retirement paperwork.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, it takes months to process retirements, and it involves this huge, complicated system. Neil thinks it could all be handled by a much smaller team using modern technology.
It's true. A lot of government processes seem pretty outdated.
Yeah.
And it feeds into this idea that the government is just like this big, slow-moving machine. A lot of people think it needs a serious upgrade.
And Neil seems to think that the private sector, with its focus on innovation, could offer some solutions.
It's an interesting idea.
I mean, it's kind of funny to imagine, like, government employees riding around on bicycles with carts full of paperwork.
That's a funny image.
But it does kind of illustrate his point.
It does, and that's one of Neil's strengths. He uses these vivid images and humor to make his points memorable, even when he's talking about, potentially boring topics like bureaucracy.
Right.
But it's also something to be mindful of.
What do you mean?
Well, sometimes these techniques can oversimplify complex issues.
Oh, I see. So it's all about balance.
It is.
Finding that balance between entertainment and accuracy.
Exactly.
And one thing Neil really emphasizes throughout the video is individual action. He wants people to think for themselves. He tells them to question everything. Don't just blindly trust authority figures.
That's a good message.
Yeah. And he even promotes his own financial courses and newsletter, which, makes sense given his background.
Right. It's all about becoming more financially savvy and independent.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this trend of people wanting to take control of their finances and looking for information outside of traditional sources.
Definitely.
But it's also important to remember that everyone has their own agenda. You always have to consider the motivations and potential biases of the person giving you the information.
It's all about critical thinking, as we've been saying.
Exactly.
And you can't deny that Neil is passionate about what he talks about. He wants to see change. And his message definitely connects with people who feel like the system isn't working for them.
It does. And even though he might not always be nuanced, and he does raise some important point about government accountability, media bias, the whole financial system.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
It's fascinating how he blends these different things together.
What do you mean?
Well, he's got this like investigative reporting element, but he also brings in personal stories and his own entrepreneurial insights.
It's a unique style.
Yeah.
And it appeals to a wide audience.
He challenges people to think differently, to take action.
He positions himself as a voice for the people.
The people who are looking for truth and transparency.
Exactly.
It's been a wild ride through Neil's world. I'm sure our listeners have a lot to process.
A lot to think about.
So what are the key takeaways here? What do we want our listeners to remember?
I think the main thing is to always question the information you're given. It doesn't matter where it's coming from.
Whether it's the government, the news, or even, passionate YouTuber.
Right. Approach everything with a critical eye.
Be skeptical.
Be skeptical.
Don't just accept things blindly.
Neil wants people to be active participants in the information landscape, not just passive consumers.
To be informed and engaged.
Exactly.
To think for themselves, do their research, and come to their own conclusions.
That's the essence of what he's advocating for.
Even if you don't agree with everything he says.
Right.
It's about the process of critical thinking.
Absolutely.
Well, Neil McCoy Ward is certainly a force to be reckoned with. He's got a big audience, and he's definitely making an impact.
He is.
His claims might not always be perfectly nuanced, but he's tapping into some real concerns.
About the government, the media, the financial system.
He's making people think.
And that's important.
It is. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more thing we need to explore. Neil's vision of the future. He hints at some major shifts happening, not just in the U.S., but globally. What does he see on the horizon? We'll find out when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back, folks.
So we were talking about Neil's vision of the future before the break. We mentioned he sees some big shifts coming.
Yeah, he definitely thinks there are big changes on the horizon.
Like what?
Well, he believes these changes in the U.S. government, cutting spending, exposing what he sees as corruption, he thinks that will have a ripple effect across the world.
A ripple effect, huh?
Yeah, he thinks a more fiscally responsible and transparent U.S. government could really shift global power dynamics.
Wow.
And impact international relations.
Interesting. He specifically mentions the Ukraine-Russia conflict. He even suggests that its resolution could be tied to these changes happening within the U.S.
That's a bold claim.
It is. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. It's tough to draw a direct line between U.S. internal affairs and the outcome of global conflicts. But, the U.S. does play a major role in international events.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So any significant changes in U.S. policy or priorities could definitely have an impact.
A domino effect.
Exactly.
Neil also talks about this idea of a global reset.
Right. That's a term you hear a lot these days.
Yeah, it's often used by people who believe there's this major economic and political transformation underway, like a new world order.
Exactly.
And Neil seems to think that these changes in the U.S. are part of this larger shift. What do you make of this whole global reset idea?
Well, it's a complicated concept. It often gets mixed up with, speculation and conspiracy theories.
Right.
The world is definitely going through some big changes right now. Rapid technological advancements, climate change, things like that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to be careful about these grand narratives. Approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Don't get carried away.
Right. We need to look at the evidence, consider different perspectives, and avoid jumping to conclusions.
Especially those based on fear or speculation.
Exactly.
So, while Neil raises a lot of interesting points, he also leaves us with a lot of questions.
Maybe that's the point.
What do you mean?
Well, maybe he's not trying to give us all the answers. Maybe he just wants us to think critically and come to our own understanding of the world.
I like that. He's encouraging us to be active participants in the search for truth.
Exactly. He doesn't just lay out the facts. He challenges his audience to interpret them, to question assumptions, to form their own conclusions.
He's like a digital age Socrates,
I like that.
making us question everything.
And his style, even though it can be a little abrasive sometimes, it definitely cuts through the noise.
It grabs your attention.
It does, and it resonates with people who feel like they're not being heard by the mainstream.
People who feel ignored or disillusioned.
Right.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Neil McCoy Ward's world. Thanks for guiding us through it.
My pleasure.
So, as we wrap things up here, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the world is complex, and there are rarely easy answers. We need to be constantly questioning, exploring, and seeking out different perspectives.
Be curious.
Be curious.
Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. And most importantly, think for yourself.
could have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Big thanks to our expert for sharing their insights.
Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey. Be sure to like and subscribe to the Journeyman Podcast for more deep dives into the world of ideas. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the journey going.